I will take this time to introduce our three panelists, and then that way, once they start speaking, more of the audience will begin to benefit from it. The first speaker is Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, who is the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Russian Federation to the United States. Prior to that, this is all here in your paper. He was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. I first heard about Ambassador Kislyak when he was Russia's ambassador to NATO, and I would go to Brussels and meet with different people there, and they would talk about how exhausted they were at different times from their interactions with Ambassador Kislyak, and they said, if you ever get in an argument with them, be prepared to lose. And so then when he was named ambassador here to Washington, and we met, we had a wonderful, long discussion at which I felt, for those of you who know American boxing, if you remember the boxer George Foreman, who won the Olympics and then was the heavyweight champion, as I walked out, but who was a very kind and gentle man as well as being a great fighter. And I walked out and I said, okay, I know what it feels like to spar with George Foreman, because I had no cuts, I was conscious still, but we had a really good time with it. And so we're very honored that Ambassador Kislyak has joined us here. He's extremely knowledgeable about Russian nuclear policy, arms control, and disarmament. So we couldn't have a better interlocutor on that. Following the ambassador will be Dr. Yao Yunshu, who is a senior colonel in the Chinese People's Liberation Army, but is here in her capacity as a scholar, where she is affiliated as a fellow with the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. Those of us who've had the pleasure of being at her presentations realize that she really is a scholar of these issues, and a very, very good one. And so we're also honored and delighted to have her here today to be giving in her personal scholarly capacity a perception of the NPR. And then finally we have James Acton, who's an associate and a dear colleague here at the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Program. James has his PhDs in physics from Cambridge University. He's done work at King's College, and is doing work right now, a major study of the low numbers problem, the problem that if and when the U.S. and Russia were to negotiate beyond the New START Treaty, perhaps beyond that, and get down into, say, the hundreds of nuclear weapons, and you start thinking about managing international security and order with low numbers of nuclear weapons, it brings up a lot of interesting challenges that haven't really been addressed, and so he's engaged in a study to work on that. You heard him when he asked the question earlier. He has an accent that gives away that he is a citizen of the United Kingdom, so he will be representing, in a sense, the UK view on the nuclear posture. So let me now turn it over to Ambassador Kislyak to give us a sense of Russian perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Perkovich, for the presentation. I would say that even now, after moving to Washington, I'm still heavyweight. And my wife sometimes says overweight. And maybe it's one of the reasons why Gary fled without having listened to me. But he most probably was fearful, but in vain. I am not offering a kind of outright critique of what he had to say, nor am planning to hail the new posture of the nuclear posture of the United States. Still, for us, it's a declaratory policy, and we have to see how it's going to be implemented in real life, how it is going to be translated into the force deployment, and how it is going to be translated into cooperation between our two countries on issues that presumably are correctly underlined in the NPR as major challenges for the United States, and they are the same by the same token, major challenges for us. The heavy accent in the NPR on non-proliferation is very close to our understanding as to where the biggest problems lie today. We are no longer locked in the Cold War. More, I would underline there is no basis for resurrection of the Cold War, and I do not see it returning anytime in the future. At the same time, have we extracted ourselves from the deterrence concepts? Not yet. We still live in the same deterrence environment. And the military postures that are developed both in the United States and Russia and some other countries are still based on the same concept of environment, maybe modified somewhat to adjust for new realities and emerging ability to work together on managing that kind of relationship. Returning to what I started with, the focus, increased focus, and I would say even optically it seems to be priority number one for the American administration is non-proliferation and combating nuclear terrorism. It's very much the same in Russian understanding of what the challenges are. That gives us a lot of chance to work together. I'm not suggesting that we have never worked on non-proliferation or on combating nuclear terrorism with the United States. Moreover, even with the previous administrations, we have started some, I think, good initiatives, including initiative to combat nuclear terrorism. That is ongoing, and that is being something that increasingly contributing to realigning countries in the practical efforts to combat the threat of nuclear terrorism. We had been partners in working to beef up the regime of the non-proliferation based on the non-proliferation treaty. We are depositories of the treaty, as are the United States and the United Kingdom, and as such have been very active in trying to help the treaty not only to survive, but also to become a kind of underpinning of international stability in the world. And in a way, we have succeeded in this, not only us, but all the countries members of the treaty, because currently is the treaty the most adhered to, except for the UN Charter. There is no other instrument, be it in arms control or in any other field, that counts as many members as the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That certainly says that whatever difficulties we are facing with the treaty now, with the compliance with the treaty, we still all believe that is the norm, that is the norm that needs to be preserved, and it is something we want to become universal. Here, United States policy and Russian policies are very much coincide strategically. However, we do not see eye to eye on some tactical issues, but strategically we are very much in the same boat, and we have been working on these issues together. The NPR certainly addresses Russia, and we are, as Gary said, one of the explicit addressee of the messages that the American administration put into the document. The way it is portrayed is extending the willingness of the United States to work with us on arms control, and we consider it's good. We have restarted the practice of negotiating arms control agreements, and we have been successful in achieving the next START treaty that had been signed and will be considered by both parliaments, I hope, within months to come. I think it's a solid document. Some criticize it of not being too drastic, but I would like to remind you that we have resurrected the culture of working together on nuclear arms after almost a decade of absolute absence of any substantive discussions on management of this issue, except for the Moscow Treaty, which certainly was important, but was more declaratory than comprehensive classical arms control. I was watching the negotiations leading to the signature of the agreement, and having been working in arms control for quite a long period of time, I would say there are new features in the process of negotiations, which I liked very much. It's no longer confrontational. And people were not trying to outsmart each other. They were trying to explain what are the reasons behind position of each of the country, trying to find mutual accommodation. And it's good, and it's something that augurs well for our ability to work further on these issues. We certainly are willing to work further, but first and foremost, we need to get this agreement ratified and enforced. And we also need to sit together and to think together with the United States as to what are the next steps that needs to be taken. Gary was coming out his way underlining the understanding by the American administration that in order to work further on arms control, we need to take totality of the issues that are defining the needs in deterrence. And it's not only the nuclear delivery vehicles or nuclear weapons themselves. There are many new factors that do affect strategic calculations by any nuclear weapon countries, including mine. Gary referred to some of the concerns we have. One is BMD development in this country, that if unchecked could undermine strategic balance. There is a new phenomenon, it's appearance of strategic weapons in non-nuclear mode. We are yet to understand as what it is, how it's going to be deployed, what are the numbers, what are the missions. Because when you speak to specialists, both in this country or in mine, all of them would say that strategic weapons with conventional warheads, with the increased precision and increased explosive power, can substitute for the nuclear weapons in some of the strategic missions. So it's not that benign as it sounds just by saying it's not nuclear. By the way, in the current agreement, and Gary also indicate this, we included a possibility that the United States is considering of a number of non-nuclear weapon systems into the accounting rules of the treaty, thus far agreeing, at least for the 10 years to come, that they are as sensitive to us as nuclear weapons themselves. So whatever is considered next has to address the concerns about the strategic value and strategic dangers of the strategic weapons in non-nuclear mode. And also, one of the things that certainly needs to be addressed, if one designs that kind of weapons for allegedly missions other than those assigned today to nuclear weapons, how you distinguish the two. Because if a missile started from territory to the United States to target whatever it is outside of the Russian Federation, how we know that it's not meant to be sent to us? And the time that is needed to calculate all these things, the time that is needed to stop the automaticity of the early warning systems, it's very short. So it might prove very destabilizing, and it's something that we certainly need to look into together significantly in the future. Also, what is important is that we are not only the two nuclear weapon country. We have several more, and further reductions of nuclear weapons have to take into account that fact. Moreover, unlike the United States, we face 3 nuclear weapon countries in NATO, and we are not yet in the relationships with NATO where we can sit idly in front of the fireplace and relaxing about the capability being deployed next to our borders. We are not there, so we have to take it seriously. So we have 3 nuclear weapon countries with the capabilities assigned to collective protection, quote unquote, of NATO countries. That is also a factor that has to be taken into calculation when we look at the strategic situation, and it's something we want to talk to our American friends and hopefully with the others as well. I do not buy easily an argument that we have so many weapons that we can afford to go down without looking at the other nuclear weapon countries. First of all, do we know what is going to happen with the nuclear capabilities of other countries? Do we know that at no point in time France or United Kingdom will decide to drastically increase their numbers to compensate for the reductions of the United States? I hope it's not going to happen. But if we are serious about managing the systems that are at the core of the security of the states. We need to deal with these issues seriously, upright, and in honest fashion. When it comes to NPR, it's an American document. It's not my job to criticize it, to hail some parts of it. We are trying to understand what it is for us there. Does it change significantly the challenges that we have faced so far in the military area? We are yet to see, because the distance between the declaratory statement and the translation of the statement in force deployment policies are years. And most probably the effect of these changed perceptions in metals, as we said in Russian, will be felt by us within, I don't know how many years, but not necessarily even before elections in this country. And we need to also understand how sustainable these policies are going to be. But we certainly see the opportunities to work together on both managing the nuclear relations between two of us and in the world. We see a lot of opportunities to work on non-proliferation issues together. And I would say also that the willingness of the United States to decrease the emphasis on nuclear weapons in pursuit of security of itself and the other countries allegedly sounds encouraging. Moreover, the intent to work on these issues in order to move towards the zero in the future is something that we share. The issue is how you do it in a way that would be sustainable and also beneficial to the other states and not at the expense of other states. And here there are a number of issues that needs to be dealt with. Some of our American colleagues presenting NPR has already said publicly, as far as I remember, that they can afford this because they have a huge superiority in conventional weapons that can deal with the security issues now in a different way. Most probably is true. But does it comfort the others? We are yet to see how these policies will be translated. For example, I will tell you that as of today, more than 1 year after the new administration came to power, we haven't been able to resume a dialogue on conventional weapons in Europe. It's still pending. And the disparities there are great. And the treaty on conventional weapons is in a very difficult situation because our American friends and our NATO friends decided not to get the adapted treaty ratified. And today we live still, physically or legally, in a treaty that had been negotiated and signed for Warsaw Pact and NATO. We still live in a treaty that regulates the relations between NATO and Warsaw Pact. The majority of former Warsaw Pact countries moved to NATO, took with them and pocketed, I would say, the quota for conventional weapons, adding them to NATO capabilities, or at least the collective quotas, and telling us that everything was okay and the treaty worked. The reason why we negotiated the amendment to the treaty was exactly that we no longer locked in NATO-Warsaw Pact relationship, but we are still guided by the treaty of the old Cold War times. That's a problem, and it's still a heavyweight problem in security issues in Europe. That's why we want to have a new maybe process to address generally security issues in Europe, and we would like to see the CFE treaty issues resolved on a reasonable and honest basis. That in turn adds some difficulties to negotiated nuclear agreements between the United States and Russia. Having enumerated all these issues that are still with us, I'm in no way suggesting that we are not willing to work with the United States on nuclear arms control. We are. And the goal of zero in nuclear field has been supported both by the President of the United States and by the President of the Russian Federation. But we need to do it with open eyes and fully understanding the challenges that we need to deal with head-on and honestly. As to the declaratory policy on the use of nuclear weapons, Mr. Prokofiev advised me to explain what is our policy, because there had been misperceptions that as a result of these imbalances in conventional weapons, we might have increased reliance on nuclear weapons, which is not the case. And recently we published a Russian news strategy that says that we can use nuclear weapons only in two circumstances: when us or our allies are attacked with nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, or if us or our allies are attacked with conventional weapons and the very existence of the state is at risk. So I would submit that our formula is much more explicit than even that newly established by the American administration, because it's not that we qualify countries on subjective way as to whether they comply with the treaties and what number of treaties or not. And extreme circumstances under which in the United States the nuclear weapon can be used is, to us, is a little bit elastic a formula, whereas for ourselves we have decided we'll use it only if the very existence of the state is at stake. So thank you very much, and I will be ready to engage in Q&A if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kislyak. Senior Colonel Yao.
Okay. Because I'm going to use my computer, so I prefer to sit here and give my presentation. Thank you for inviting me, George, to give my personal thoughts on the newly released nuclear posture review. I think the report has something encouraging, something disappointing, and both are having implications for China. First, I'm going to talk about the encouraging things. There are at least 4 things that's encouraging. The NPR changed the threat perception, and nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism are defined as top nuclear threats instead of nuclear attack from major nuclear powers. And this change in perception provides a broader basis for further nuclear disarmament, for strengthening the NPT, and also for broader international cooperation on nuclear security. The second good thing about the NPR is that it reduced the role of nuclear weapons in American national security strategy by doing 3 things. One is by excluding all but a few NPT member states as possible nuclear targets. The NPR limits the possible target countries to less than 10. And within this small number, some are allies and partners, so the actual number of states against which the United States reserve the right to use nuclear weapons is limited to 4 or 5, as it stands currently. And the NPR makes a promise that the nuclear use will be considered only in extreme circumstances and for the vital interest of the United States, its allies and partners. Though we still have to find out what vital interest and extreme circumstances mean. And the third thing the NPR does to restrain the role of the nuclear weapons is it set the course for for transformation by making the sole purpose policy an objective in the future. Although the United States has not yet adopted a sole purpose policy, but it clearly, explicitly set it as a future objective in the report. So it gives us at least the hope that the general trend is toward a further restrictive, a further limited role for the nuclear weapons. And the third good thing about NPR is it promised to have less nuclear weapons. The continued reduction of both warheads and the delivery means, as agreed upon in the New START with Russia, should be cheered as a step, although not as big as most people would like to see, but at least it's a step in the right direction. The significance lies in the momentum that such a move helps to set in motion in the future. It is encouraging to read the commitment in the NPR, namely that after ratification of the New START, post-New START negotiations with Russia would resume on further strategic arms reduction, and this time including non-deployed and non-strategic nuclear weapons, and in a more comprehensive way, maybe BMD ballistic missile defense systems and prompt global strike capabilities would also be considered. And the fourth thing, the good thing about the NPR is it promised to develop no new nuclear weapons, and this should not be underappreciated. The NPR has forsaken new nuclear weapons, or to be more exact in the words of the NPR report, the United States has decided not to seek new nuclear capabilities aimed to fulfill new military missions. And just now, on the last session, there are some questions asked and clarification made on that part of the NPR. The disappointing thing about NPR, first, is the reduction of nuclear weapons role is one step forward, but half step backward. The negative security assurance to the non-nuclear weapon states has two conditions. One is NPT compliance, and the other is the right to reverse if the United States sees growing CBW danger. This declaratory policy is some distance from the sole purpose policy that many people urged the Obama administration to adopt. It is even further away from a no-first use policy as adopted and suggested many times by China. The second disappointing thing about NPR is that now it is clearly defined, stated that the United States keeps its nuclear arsenal for basically two purposes. One is to deter potential regional adversaries such as North Korea and Iran. Another is to maintain strategic stability vis-a-vis Russia and China. For the first purpose, I don't think the current nuclear force posture has much relevance. And for the second purpose, it is hard to find a continued need for a triad nuclear structure kept on constant alert status and backed by upgraded nuclear potential. Now that the Russian is defined, is no longer defined as an enemy, and China shares increasing responsibility and interests with the United States. So the change in threat perception has not changed the Cold War deterrence logic. At least it has not changed this Cold War deterrence logic fundamentally. The third thing about the NPR that is somewhat disappointing is the ballistic missile defense and the primed global strike capabilities, PGS. Ballistic missile defenses and conventionally armed ballistic missiles play a bigger role in deterring potential regional nuclear adversaries and also in maintaining strategic stability with Russia and China. Missile defense has been a source of tension with both Russia and China for at least 2 decades. The ballistic missile defense review report released earlier this year in early February made it clear that the United States would not trade BMD in its negotiation with Russia. So this source of tension is going to stay. Even though the NPR suggested initiatives to Russia for confidence-building measures and for cooperation, such as assurance that the United States, the BMD system that is going to be deployed in Europe and the conventionally armed missiles are not aimed to affect the strategic balance with Russia, but only against the newly emerged regional missile threats, and also suggested cooperations such as integration of sensors, early warning systems, joint missile defense architecture, joint testing, modeling, simulation, and joint exercises. I think these are all very positive suggestions, but I still foresee troubles in the future disarmament process caused by the BMD. And lastly, I want to talk about the implications for China. What are the things that China would like to know from the NPR? I want to emphasize again that it's my own personal views. I think China would like to say how is China defined in the NPC, because the 2001 NPR, the 2001 Nuclear Posture Review did 2 things that had extremely negative impact on China's view of the United States. One is it categorized China with 6 other countries against whom the United States might use nuclear weapons. The second thing is that it cited military confrontation over the status of Taiwan as an immediate contingency for possible nuclear weapon use. These 2 things have been most frequently quoted, cited in Chinese literature to show that the United States took China as an enemy and planned to use nuclear weapons for defending Taiwan. The new NPR gives much more weight to Asia and China this time as compared with the previous 2 NPRs. And it emphasizes interdependence and shared responsibilities with China and makes an effort to send a positive message to China by defining it mainly as a partner to cooperate in international affairs. The keynote about China in the NPR is that China is not an enemy, but we have to hedge against future uncertainties. And at the same time, the NPR expressed concerns on behalf of the United States and also on behalf of China's Asian neighbors about China's modernization of nuclear arsenal, the lack of transparency, and its future intentions. The second thing I think China would like to know from the NPR is how is the nuclear relationship with China defined in this report? China is mentioned 37 times in the NPR report as compared to only twice in what was leaked of the last NPR report. And of the 37, China is mentioned 18 times together with Russia. In Russia and China, or Russian or China. And in most cases, in the context of strategic stability, I hope I will not overinterpret its significance, but the emphasis on strategic stability means that the United States accepts a mutual deterrence relationship with China, which should, by logic, based on mutual vulnerability. And mutual vulnerability with China now is a fact. And the United States has to design its nuclear relationship with China based on that fact. This recognition and acceptance has implications to China-American nuclear relationship. First, the United States will not try to develop offensive or defensive capabilities to neutralize China's nuclear deterrence. Second, China's concern of ballistic missile defense and conventionally armed ballistic missiles should be recognized. And I think these concerns are recognized several times in the NPR report. And third, China's nuclear weapon modernization would now consider to have a very direct impact on U.S. nuclear calculations and decisions. And the U.S. would like China to contribute its share to the strategic stability. The third thing China would like to find out from the report is, what about Taiwan? And Taiwan is not mentioned at all in the report. But this does not mean Taiwan is totally irrelevant. A question for China to ask is whether Taiwan will be considered a U.S. partner. It's not one of the 27 alliances, but is it a partner that its safety or security is dependent on U.S. protection? Or would the status quo of Taiwan Strait be considered a vital interest for the United States? Or would China's military action against Taiwan be viewed as an extreme circumstances in which nuclear weapons may be considered? I don't expect any answer to these questions because they actually fit perfectly well into the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity toward both the mainland China and Taiwan. However, this kind of strategic ambiguity functions at the cost of strategic trust. And the last thing China wants to find out is what is going to happen to U.S. BMD and the PGS systems that China is so concerned about. The NPR suggested high-level dialogues with China to enhance confidence, improve transparency, and reduce mistrust. However, China needs more than just the dialogues and talks to relieve its concerns. The NPR and the earlier ballistic missile defense review report had not given China the same specific offers that they have given to Russia. China seems part of the newly emerged regional missile threat that U.S. regional BMD system architecture are prepared against. And from the ballistic missile defense review report, I have the conclusion that the United States will now assess or evaluate China's ballistic missile capabilities not only as a threat to Taiwan, but also as a threat to its regional allies to America's maritime dominance in East Pacific, and to military troops and installations of the United States and its allies in the region. So it will be more reluctant to address the Chinese BMD concerns and provide more assurance Therefore, tension over BMD is going to stay and loom larger than before. I think that's pretty much what I want to say. Thank you.
Terrific. Wait for discussion. I'm sure there'll be lots of good questions. James.
I very much suspect this is going to be one of those very rare panels where the talks given by the officials, even if in their own personal capacity, are considerably more interesting and informative than those given by the non-officials on the panel. And that, I want to emphasize from the start, is me. Although I'm giving a UK perspective on this, the closest official representation I've ever had for the UK government is they once offered me a job in the Department for Health, which I declined. So I'm very much speaking today in my own personal capacity. It's very hard, I think, to talk about the UK and nuclear issues at the moment without at least starting by mentioning the extraordinary debate that's really taking place within the UK on nuclear issues at the moment. The profile is relatively high. Relatively is the operative word here. It's clearly not a frontline issue in the election. But there's an unusually high degree of public interest in nuclear weapons and in the UK nuclear weapon posture. And that's really as a result of three factors simultaneously being present. First is decisions over the replacement of the UK's weapons system Trident. Second is very, very significant pressure on UK finances, and especially on defence finances. And thirdly is, as those of you who've been following the election will have noticed, the sudden and unexpected rise of the Liberal Democrats, who are the one anti-Trident party. And I emphasise they're not anti-nuclear weapons, anti-British nuclear weapons, they're anti this particular delivery system. Now, when all this sound and fury of the election has subsided, and the new government comes into place, if there is one, and sets its policy, I don't expect very much to change. If there is change, and I think change is very unlikely, the most probable driver for that change will be UK domestic politics. I think it's very unlikely that the NPR will drive significant change to these very high-level questions of whether the United Kingdom should retain nuclear weapons, and if it does, what its delivery system should be. I think the NPR, from a UK perspective, more ties into a series of three second-order questions. And these are three areas that I think the UK government, from my reading, had a very strong interest coming into the NPR, and that have consequences for the UK coming out of the NPR, even if those consequences are just allowing the UK to do what it was hoping it would be able to do anyway. And those three areas that I want to discuss today are firstly the future of the UK's warheads and what it's going to do about life extension. Secondly, UK policy towards the NPT, particularly in regard to the review conference. And third, UK declaratory policy. And those are in order of importance. I think from the point of view of the UK government, the key thing it wanted out of the NPR was that the US approach to warhead life extension would be consistent with the approach that the UK wanted to take anyway. It's kind of an article of faith in the UK that it's very, very important for the UK warheads to stay as similar to the US warheads as possible. And as many of you will know, that's because of the close UK-US cooperation under the Mutual Defence Agreement. As I understand the way it works, and the details of the agreement are not public, the details of the cooperation are somewhat shrouded in secrecy, the two countries, the UK and the US, each design and manufacture the physics packages for the weapons themselves. We like to kind of do something by ourselves, at least. But beyond that, there's a lot of discussion and cooperation about general warhead physics, about safety, about reliability. And as been in the news a bit recently, the UK buys non-nuclear components from the US. And the advantages to the UK of that are very clear and simple. I mean, it just enables the UK to have a much smaller nuclear infrastructure than it would otherwise need to do. The downside to the UK is there's a very strong advantage in keeping the UK programme linked to the US programme. So what came out of the NPR was a series of 4 options, one of which was completely discarded for the future of US nuclear weapons that Gary Seymour has already talked about earlier. Firstly was the option of refurbish, which is essentially just keep the same weapons but polish them up and improve them. Not improve them, just polish them up and keep them working. Secondly is reuse of components from existing weapons. Thirdly, in extremis, is the option to replace the weapon with designs from previously with components from previously tested weapons, but that aren't in the stockpile. And fourthly, was the option of new warheads with new military capabilities that the NPR rejected entirely. Now, my understanding is that this is the US approach is actually very close to the approach that the UK was hoping the US would take, because it was the approach the UK wanted to take anyway. It's very often said, particularly here in DC, that all 4 recognised nuclear weapon states under the NPT are modernising nuclear weapons apart from the UK. Apart from the US. Now, I'm not going to speak for anybody today apart from what my understanding of the UK situation is. But that statement, at least as it applies to the UK, as far as I understand it, is untrue. Depending, of course, on what you mean by modernisation. In the 2006 UK White Paper, the UK set out an option, in its words, to refurbish the existing weapon or to replace it. But when the UK says replace, it means something quite different from what replace means in the US context. The two countries use the same word, but to mean different things. And when the UK says replace, my understanding is that it's talking about a less radical change to the existing design than the reliable replacement warhead was to the W76. That the UK plan for replacement keeps it fairly close to the current design, but obviously slightly further away than refurbishment would be. So, given that, if my understanding is correct, and I've repeated that multiple times for good reason, if my understanding is correct, then I would expect UK officials to be really very pleased with the direction that the NPR has taken. By placing the emphasis in US terms on refurbish or reuse, it's allowed the UK to keep open the option to refurbish or replace in UK terms. Now, the exact choice the UK makes is, I suspect, strongly likely to be influenced by the direction of US modernisation, on which branch of the choice the UK goes down, as far as I understand it, is yet to be determined. But the broad outlines of the programme seem at this stage to be very consistent with the UK approach. The second area of the NPR that had big implications for UK policy is that of the NPT Review Conference. The UK government, as many of you will know, very strongly buys into the argument that if we want non-nuclear weapon states to take their non-proliferation obligations more seriously and to bolster the non-proliferation regime, then it's necessary for the weapon states to take disarmament more seriously. And I emphasise that in the UK thinking, as I think in US administration's thinking, the targets of this argument are not Iran's and North Korea's, countries that are already in violation of their non-proliferation obligations. They are countries that are in compliance with their obligations, but whose help we need to bolster the non-proliferation regime further. And certainly based on conversations with UK officials were keenly aware of the importance of the presentational aspects of the NPR, the extent to which the end goal of a world free of nuclear weapons would be sold up in the NPR, the extent to which details of the deter and defeat missions that came out in leaked portions of the 2001 NPR could undermine the US's disarmament credentials, and hence the whole approach to the review conference that the UK government, as I understand it, supports. And speaking to a UK official recently, that official said that the UK was content on that score. the emphasis placed on a world free of nuclear weapons, the emphasis placed on non-proliferation as the centre of UK's nuclear policy above deterrence. I think the UK view is it very much gives something to work with at the review conference, and it's certainly better that the NPR came out than that it didn't. The final area of UK policy that I think that the NPR affects is the issue of declaratory policy. This summer, looking in from the outside, seems to have witnessed a really extraordinary series of events when it comes to declaratory policy in the UK, which have largely been behind the scenes, with one important exception that I'm going to come on to in a second. My understanding is that over last summer, late summer, in the autumn and the winter, there was a really vigorous debate within the UK government on the future of UK declaratory policy. And if the people that I've been talking to are correct, and they might very well not be, the Prime Minister himself was said to be personally very involved and engaged in this debate, and was personally very interested in pushing the UK towards no first use. The key counter-argument within Whitehall has apparently been the fear of an Iranian biological attack and the question of how to deter that. But in any case, in about March, there seemed to be a bureaucratic compromise that was going to produce a UK declaratory policy called no first strike. I don't know what this means. I don't know whether no first strike means that the UK wouldn't try to do a preemptive splendid first strike on another state, which was interesting to me because I didn't think it probably had enough weapons at sea to do that anyway, even if it wanted to. But that seemed to be what the bureaucratic compromise was going to be. The story got to the point where it was leaked to the press. On the 18th of March, there was an article on The Guardian Online by one of the journalists who's very well respected on this, announcing that there was about to be a major change in UK declaratory policy, and it was going to come out on the Prime Minister's speech on the 19th of March, which then didn't mention declaratory policy at all. Which then raised the question about why was this change of declaratory policy dropped from the Prime Minister's speech at the very last minute, and it must have been the very last minute. Well, there's various explanations and theories floating around, but one of them was that the UK didn't want to get out ahead of the NPR, that it was perceived as important within Whitehall for the UK not to change declaratory policy before the Americans, not to be seen as trying to influence the American debate, as far as I understand it. The effect of this, I think, is that the effect of the NPR is that I think that there is likely to be a change in declaratory policy after the election, but probably not the same one that there would have been before the election. UK current declaratory policy is almost identical to what US declaratory policy was before the change. The UK extends a negative security assurance to non-nuclear weapon states in compliance with their non-proliferation obligations, but has the Warsaw Pact exemption in place, the exemption that the UK reserves the right, if there's a combined attack between a non-nuclear weapon state and a weapon state, to use nuclear weapons in that circumstance, which is clearly very much a hangover from the Cold War. So I just don't see current UK declaratory policy surviving after the election. I think given America has now, 20 years late, dropped the Warsaw Pact exemption, I think it's very likely that the UK will do the same thing. But I now think it's actually relatively unlikely that the UK is going to do no first strike, whatever that meant. I think it's very unlikely that the UK is now going to go further out than the US. So those were the three areas: the Warhead Life Extension, the NPT Review Conference, and declaratory policy. And I think the UK government is probably very satisfied about the NPR. I think those in the UK and civil society who take an interest in these issues probably felt a sense of disappointment in various ways about the NPR. But from a government perspective, I think that the three UK priorities, at least as far as I, from a non-governmental perspective, understood them, were pretty much met in the NPR, and that this is a very the NPR gives a lot for the UK to work with at the review conference.
Thank you.
Great. Let's go straight away to questions. So same drill as before. Our crack team is grabbing microphones. Go ahead and start raising hands. I'm not going to totally discriminate against people who've already asked a question, but I will give priority. So keep Bonnie and Admiral, keep your hands up. But I just want to see if there are others. Then yeah, we'll start with the gentleman back there, the distinguished white beard.
That's Hugh Haskell from the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. I'd like to ask a question for Ambassador Kislyak. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the resultant dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, I'm wondering if he would like to comment on what the Russian reaction was to the lack of a reciprocal dissolution of NATO at the same time.
That question often.
No, but I like to hear that question asked, because it's something that most probably is long overdue. Seriously speaking, certainly that would be a better outcome for stability in Europe if we do not rely on one alliance that is expanding within the European space and trying to ensure equal security for its members. And I underline, for its members. Sometimes at expense of the field of security of the neighbors. So it doesn't comfort us, and with due respect to the willingness of NATO allies to work together to increase their sense of security, the alliance can do better by contributing to the European security that will favor security of all. So in this respect, I think had the NATO decided to reorganize itself in something that would be a little bit different than just a military alliance that has only one toolkit in its disposal, that is military power. That didn't occur. But it's a reality, and we are not naive to expect that tomorrow NATO will cease to exist. We deal with the organization the way it is and the way it evolves. We have tried to build relations with the alliance. Now we are in third attempt to build cooperation with the alliance. The first one was when we agreed on the Founding Act, and at that time we thought that that was a good opening to work on issues other than Article 5 and to build partnership that will dispel mutual animosities. It didn't work because NATO didn't feel that Russia is a good partner for them to be part of security discussions that affect security of NATO alliance. We were always kept behind the door and told, wait until we decide what is good for NATO, then we'll tell you how you can help us to build security of NATO. It didn't work for us. Then the first war in Europe launched by NATO, that is against Serbia, our relations were frozen. Then a difficult pirouette of reestablishing a second attempt to build relations with NATO with the Rome Declaration that outlined 9 or 10 items of possible cooperation between us, and those are as valid today as they had been in the past. It's non-proliferation, terrorism, and many other things. We've tried. Events in Georgia helped us to understand once again how fragile these relations are because they lack serious political underpinning. And the events in Georgia brought to a total freeze of our relations with the alliance because when these events occurred, we rushed to the NATO-Russia Council to discuss the situation, to explain what was happening and to seek views of others. What we were told that NATO didn't want to talk to us, full stop. However, when we created NATO-Russia Council, the underpinning idea was that NATO-Russian Council as a vehicle for discussions was as important in good times as it should be important in the bad times. The very first test of the bad times, NATO didn't comply with that kind of understanding. Now we're in a third wave of attempts to build relations with NATO. We'll see how things will develop. Thank you.
Thank you. because I happen to believe Dr. Yao's points about China in the NPR are maybe the most important part of the NPR and most innovative, I want to turn to Admiral McFadden and Bonnie, because I assume you may be asking about China to help elaborate this. Katie, come here. What ranks you, Bonnie?
I'm not so sure about that. Eric McVaden, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Senior Colonel Yao, you encouraged me and did not disappoint me. To follow up on your theme. There is so much that you gave me to think about, and I look forward to reviewing and digesting what you said, but let me try to draw you out on one point. China already has short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles with conventional and nuclear warheads that could be confused. And of course, there's also the anti-ship ballistic missile that most people think is under development that could fall in the same category. The U.S. is, as we discussed earlier, talking about prompt global strike, so there's that added factor there. Were you suggesting that this is something that we simply need to be more candid about and understand and mutually understand that we have to hedge, and or that you had some hope that maybe these are not deployed? What were you aiming at there in your discussion?
Before you answer, let me get Bonnie's question out, because I assume it's for you also, and you can take the two questions at the same time.
Thank you, Yao Yunju. Bonnie Glazer, CSIS. What I'd like to do is to try to press you on the issue of the obstacles to China being more transparent about its arsenal, and not just current arsenal, but where it's building to in the future. In my view, total secrecy made sense when China's arsenal was very vulnerable. I think we could argue today that China has reduced its vulnerability and perhaps for the first time has a reliable second strike capability. But yet China is not yet willing to really declare what it has or what it's building to in terms of number of warheads, and no discussion at all about its new sea-based system publicly, or solid fuel mobile ballistic ICBMs that it's deploying. Now, Gary Seymour said that this is really due to disparity in numbers. Now, my sense is that it is more due to China's worry that the United States seeks to deny China a second strike capability, and you talked about concerns about prompt global strike and missile defense. So if it's the latter, then what assurances are you looking for from the United States? Is it exchange of technical capabilities? Would you like to understand perhaps more about our missile defense capabilities? Are you looking for more of a rhetorical statement? And in addition to that, which I assume you will agree with, are there other obstacles that are really standing in the way of China being more transparent about its arsenal? Thank you.
First, about Eric's question about China's short and medium-ranged missiles. I think China's policy, nuclear policy, is very clear. It's no first use. So I really don't think that a second use, for China to keep a second use capability, nuclear capability, it would be, I would put it in another way. I think that because China adopts a no first use policy, and I have been in the United States for 7 months. I have been reading all the articles speculating on China's ballistic short and medium range ballistic missiles and what kind of threat it would pose to U.S. Carrier battle groups and U.S. bases in Okinawa and Guam and things like that. But I think it's overplayed threat because it shouldn't be considered as a nuclear threat in the first place because China's policy is no first use. No first use means that China would strike back after it has been struck by nuclear weapons. So that's my answer to you. I can just answer so much. And as to Abani's question, what is the major obstacles for China to be more transparent? It also has to do. It has to do with two things of China's nuclear policy. One is the no first use. Another is the small arsenal China has been keeping all the time, and the no first use policy means China has to absorb the first strike, and after that, the small arsenal would be substantially reduced to have a reliable second strike capability. And so being less transparency or being opaque, actually I think is part of the strategy to keep the arsenal effective to deter. It's not just it's just not something to have to do with strategic trust, or because even if we trust the Russians or we trust we don't tell them our nuclear how much we have, and it's just a built-in, an embedded part of China's deterrence, because we actually depend more on opaqueness for deterrence effect. So I think there is a very fundamental change in China's deterrence thinking from U.S. and Western deterrence thinking because of the no first use policy. If we don't have that no first use policy, I think we can be more transparent. But we have to stick to the no first use policy. At the same time, we have to keep a small arsenal. We don't want to spend a lot of money on that because we think it's useless to spend a lot of money on it. So opaqueness is used to enhance the deterrence. And also, Bonnie asked what assures that. So the BMD and the PGS is really a big issue to China's reduced arsenal after first strike. Because after the first strike, the small would be further reduced to very small. So to assure Chinese on BMD, I think that all the initiatives that the United States are having with Russian and offered to Russian would be helpful to China.
And I think that's what's implied and suggested in the NPR, actually, and putting all of those sentences in there where China and Russia are mentioned in the same sentence. I think that's exactly the logic that's intended. In the back. Thanks, Kim.
Yes, Mike Pevsner, U.S. Senate staff. Ambassador Kislyak, a question for you, and if I might, in keeping with the topic of this conference, have a MERVed question. It seems like from your comments, you described the new start as a sort of reset in terms of arms control between the United States and Russia. Undersecretary Burns recently called that perhaps an unfortunate metaphor, but that still there were more possibilities than not between the United States and Russia in the future. How would you characterize START as it plays into that reset between the United States and Russian relations? And also, do you see any linkages between the treaty, the United States rethinking of its ballistic missile policy in Europe, as well as Russian attitudes towards possibly sanctioning Iran? Thank you.
First of all, the second question is the easiest. There is no linkage at all because we are not in the business of deals, not a kind of qui pro quo. On the contribution of the START agreement to the overall reset of our relations, I think it's, first of all, is a result of the reset of the relations, because prior to that, that kind of discussions hadn't been available for the United States and Russia for almost a decade. And it was the first practical thing that we have accomplished in the reset that reinforces the dynamics of reset. And I would say that even, as I have already alluded to that, even the atmospheres at the negotiating table in Geneva were quite different from what it had been the case, say, 10, 20 years ago at negotiations between the Soviet Union and United States. It was, I wouldn't say a partnership, because each of the delegation was mindful of its national security needs. But the way things were negotiated were more in terms of explaining what are the concerns, what are the problems, what people can do, cannot do, how we can find a solution that would be more win-win rather than zero-sum. I wouldn't say that any arms control is a classical win-win, but this treaty has a more win-win than in the previous negotiations. So my sense is that as a result of these negotiations and as a result of the reborn willingness to sit together and to address major security issues together on a cooperative basis, that would be playing an important role.
Well, I mean, have people who haven't asked. This gentleman here, yeah, thank you.
Hello, Yusuf Butt from Harvard University. This is a question for Colonel Yao. I was interested in your remarks about the Chinese concern over the planned U.S. missile defenses, and I'd like to know, I know it's a hypothetical, but what would be the planned Chinese responses as we go forward with the defenses into 2015, 2020? I understand there's a Chinese trial program for their own ballistic missile defenses, and India also recently did that. So, you know, one option is increasing the Chinese stockpile. The other is having a Chinese domestic ballistic missile defense system also. So I'd just like to know your thoughts on that.
Actually, I'm not going to speak for my government. So all these questions are. Because the ballistic missile defense systems has implications to China's nuclear deterrent. So there is only two options for China to do. One is to set up its own defenses. Another is to increase offensive capabilities to overwhelm or to overcome the defenses. And I think China has to consider both of them.
That was
No.
Andrew.
Andrew Pierre, Georgetown University. I'd like to go back to the question of multilateral arms control negotiations looking at lower levels. We've heard different views here. Gary Seymour seemed to be saying that the Russian-American levels are still so high that to bring in the other three nuclear powers too early would not be productive, put it that way, perhaps. Ambassador Kislyak, correctly, it seems to me, looked at the world from Moscow and saw British and UK and French, and one could add to that Chinese weapons, although he didn't cite China.
I didn't mention it.
And it seems to me that's a perfectly logical perspective. So I'd like to ask James Acton, you made some very interesting comments about the British nuclear debate today and the heightened debate. There is interest, I think, in Britain in entering into multilateral negotiations. So is this a point of potential difference between, I think Gary was talking perhaps in a personal term rather than a governmental decision, but do you believe that Britain and perhaps even France would want to participate in a further round? I'd like to ask the same question to Senior Colonel Liao. What is Chinese thinking about possibly participating in multilateral nuclear reduction negotiations, not next year or two, but the next 5-10 years perhaps?
I'm going to take half of your question. I'm not going to try to speculate on what my French friends are thinking. There is a very clear UK official government line on this, which government officials regularly say, which is that the UK will take part in multilateral arms control when it is helpful to do so. Which is in itself a very unhelpful statement because it clearly leaves the interesting part out, which is what is helpful to do so. So let me give you my own personal opinion on the UK involvement in arms control. And actually, this is also the way that I think that France and China should be involved, and just from my kind of own academic perspective. I don't think it makes any sense to include the other three states at this stage in formal five-way arms control. I think that the disparity in numbers between the US and Russia and the other three mean that you really need to have another round of formal arms control between the US and Russia before it makes sense to bring in anybody else. However, that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that the UK, France and China can just sit there and do nothing about paving the way towards a world without nuclear weapons. And what I would, in my ideal world, there would be a kind of five-way, or perhaps two different groups. I think the sequencing of this is complicated, where the UK, France, and China took part in strategic dialogue and put in place the kind of transparency measures that would facilitate multilateral arms control further down the line. Multilateral arms control will fail if 5 states just sit down without preparation and say, okay, guys, let's negotiate our way down. There's going to have to be initial work to pave the way for those negotiations, to do with notifying everybody else, just informally to start with, about the numbers and types of nuclear weapons, and set up the kind of information base and trust on which arms control is based. Now, each of the three states, the UK, the US, and France, are going to have different preconditions for taking part in that dialogue, and I think Colonel Yao has already made it clear what Chinese concerns are. My sense about the UK is government officials have not seriously thought about what multilateral arms control will involve. The current UK formulation is a very, very easy thing to say, and my sense is there hasn't been serious internal thinking about everything else I've said in this answer beyond the first couple of sentences.
I think China is supporting arms disarmament all the time, but China is different from United States and Russia in that it considers itself not so pressed to enter into the process of disarmament on several reasons. Mostly I have mentioned already. But I think China has made the promise to enter into multilateral disarmament process when the two biggest nuclear powers have reduced their nuclear arsenal to a certain amount, and that should include non-deployed nuclear warheads, and also a very strong verification system. But China has not declined to enter into multilateral, but the position from China right now is that you still have too much, and it's far away for us to seriously consider that we should enter into the process. But I think the time is nearer, is coming, is more and more, is approaching, is not so distant that is China should not consider it. And actually we have very serious discussions among ourselves on what kind of a criteria that China should come up with to define the certain amount, and on what should be the. I think we have very serious discussions of that kind of things.
Thank you. That's very important.
that last part about the preparation. I'm going to give Ambassador
Couple
Kislyak
words,
the
yes.
last word, and then we're going to take a break and go to the...
Couple of words on the same question. I remember some 20 years, maybe 25 years ago, when the whole process of negotiations on strategic arms between the Soviet Union and Russia started. We also were asking the other nuclear weapon countries at the time when and under what conditions that they will be willing to join. I do not recollect exact formulas of the time, but I think the prevailing formula almost among all the three nuclear weapon countries other than Soviet Union and Russia were that they will be willing to join as soon as Russia and Soviet Union and United States would achieve significant reductions. When we achieved SALT and SALT II, the formula moved a little bit to 50% reductions. When we achieved START, now we have certain reductions, and when it is proved to be helpful. And it's less than fair. We need to have a predictability when we and the United States want to move further, especially when you start talking about real drastic reductions. You need to be sure that first, while you reduce, others are willing to contribute. And those countries which do not possess nuclear weapons do not acquire them. So it's a very complex world. So we think that we are to move further, and I hope we will. We need to have all other nuclear weapon countries on board. Granted, we are not talking about the same kind of commitment, but they need to be part of the process, joining in while we are reducing with the United States. Thank you.
That too was a very important answer. So I really want to thank this panel. It's been great. It's been really, really insightful. The questions were great as well. So I want to thank the panel, and I want to return back in 10 minutes to resume the next panel, and then we'll go to lunch.